Hello and welcome to The Booking Club, the podcast that brings you today's leading authors and commentators from a table at their favourite places to eat and drink. I'm your host, Jack Aldane, and on this episode, I'm going to be speaking to broadcaster and author Timandra Harkness about her new book, Technology is Not the Problem. We'll leave it at that. Okay. Timandra Harkness, it's a delight to have you on the Booking Club. Thank you for agreeing to come on to talk about your latest book. We're sat in a very noisy Thursday afternoon Jamaica winehouse. One of the original, if not the original, coffee houses of London?
It's the first one in London and the second one in England. Founded in, I think, 1652. And now, as you say, well, I think the building's different, but now it's a wine bar. Yeah. But
that would be reason enough to choose this place to come and meet. But actually, this place has a very special relevance to your latest book, Technology is Not the Problem. So I'll leave it to you to say what that is before we get started.
Well, somewhat to a few people's surprise, when I wanted to describe how we got to the place we are with technology personalizing everything for us, I found I had to go back quite a few hundred years. And 17th century London was a very key place. And this place in particular, well, the coffee house, was a place where Samuel Pepys used to sit and chat to John Graunt, who's a very underappreciated person in history, because he basically invented a lot of statistical ideas that would then become really important and now become part of data analysis.
So this was an old hangout of men like John Graunt and Samuel Pepys. And for anyone who doesn't know who Samuel Pepys is, perhaps for our international audience, you can give a brief summary of the man.
Very good point. Samuel Pepys, famous in England for having kept a diary, I think possibly one of the earliest personal diaries that then became decoded and published, because he kept it in code because the rude bits. And he described this real turning point in London, which was the end of the Commonwealth after the English Civil War, the beginning of the Restoration, but also a time of transformation in London where trade and international trade was starting to grow, which would eventually take over from the old kind of economic model of feudalism. Basically, you grow stuff, guilds, craftspeople make stuff, and it's all very controlled and traditional. And then within really Pepys's lifetime, this was transforming into the world of the East India Company, where it's all about international trade and buying things abroad, bringing them back here to be processed. The international money-based economy was taking over. I mean, what we will in hindsight call capitalism, although of course at the time they didn't think of it that way.
In each chapter of this book, you give a great bite-sized history of the various iterations of technological progress that have brought us to where we are today. But the book's title I wanted to start with, simply because every time I see a book whose title contradicts or challenges a presupposed argument, I always wonder at what point was it the last straw for the author, where they thought, I'm sick and tired of hearing this assertion or this orthodoxy, I'm going to take it on in my next book. It's going to say on the cover, this position doesn't check out. Was there a moment like that for you with this book? Had you gotten tired of people saying that technology was the problem?
It wasn't that sudden, I think. And in fact, this wasn't the first title of the book. It went through a couple of previous titles, and Technology is Not the Problem was originally one of the subtitles we thought about. And then discussing it with the editor and my agent, in fact, we just decided that it was better to be upfront and say, no, the argument of the book is that the problem here is not the technology. The problem is us. And yeah, as you say, so it's a bit of a everything you think about this is wrong. But in fact, I started off from the position that maybe technology was the problem, and that it was doing things to us, it was taking away our agency and so on. And then I gradually went, no, you know what, I kind of zoomed out, I suppose, till I looked at the bigger picture and thought, the technology's not causing this to happen. We have the technology we have because of the world we live in, where we're all very individualized and we're all increasingly obsessed with ourselves and how we are seen by others. And so it's no wonder we end up with technology that personalizes everything for us, because we kind of believe that that's how the world should be, that the world should revolve around each of us, because each of us is very special and very different from everybody else.
Another book that may stand in slight contrast to your own, but which I saw on your bookshelf when you were promoting this episode, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. Brilliant book, and one that I needed to revisit when I was researching this one. She very much seems to be coming at it from the angle that technology is the problem, or rather that those who control the architecture are really turning our coherent sense of selves into raw material, as she puts it, to be used by the data mining technology. However, I'm slightly more convinced, not that that is the whole of her argument, but I'm slightly more convinced by what you're saying, that really technology amplifies what's already inherent in us.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's not, I mean, a lot of the things that Shoshana Zuboff describes, I don't have any issue with the fact that our data is gathered and used to profile us and used to sell things back to us. I just think that to say that that has agency and that makes us do things is the wrong way around. That, in fact, the technology doesn't have agency. Now, obviously, again, she's right to say, but the companies that design the platforms and own the platforms and aggregate the data are very powerful because they have control over this information flow. But again, they can only do that because there is something in us that responds to this promise of constant affirmation of who we are and how special we are. But I think you've put your finger on it there, that although there is a kind of timeless element that human beings, because we're social, we need to know that we are recognized by other social beings. So we need to know where we belong in the web of society. But we are uniquely, I think, in Western societies now, we are uniquely individualized and atomized, and therefore uniquely vulnerable to this need to have our identities recognized and reflected back to us. And that, I think, is what the technology taps into. So, I mean, one thing I think I disagree with Shoshana Zuboff on is that she seems to think this is a completely new model of capitalism, that data in itself becomes a source of value. And I don't think that's right. I think data is just a new and remarkably efficient way to tap into sources of value and to sell things. I don't think data necessarily is a great source of value in itself. I mean, you know, it can be if you can use it to do something, but I think that's rather overstated. I think what we have is the same model of capitalism, but really efficient ways to sell things to people. And even that is a little overstated because the advertising companies go, oh, no, we can get you the perfect audience for this and we can sell this to exactly the people who will buy it. And actually, it turns out it's not that efficient. And marketing is not that individualized.
It doesn't always get it right, does it? As you yourself have discovered on many an occasion. What is your relationship to technology over the last, say, 15 years of increased digitization and individualization of our handheld devices? The things that you've slowly kind of pieced together over the last decade or so that has given you your understanding as it is today of technology?
Well, the getting it wrong, as you'll have noticed in the book, is hilariously, I did the online psychometric test where you can do the test and then it's the Cambridge Psychometric Centre, which is not connected to Cambridge Analytica, but they did originate that kind of approach to analysis. So you can give it access to your social media feed. So I gave it access to my Twitter feed, as it then was, and it told me I was a man aged about 30, which I'm not. For listeners that can't see me,
categorically,
I am neither of those things. That was something that really made me think. Yeah, I think this kind of spooky magic where it can read your mind is somewhat overstated.
What do you think gave it the idea that you were a man at the age of 30?
Well, I mean, presumably from the Twitter feed, it was the kind of people that I follow, the kind of things I tweet about, because it identified my interests quite accurately. It gives you, Twitter itself will give you a list of the interested things you have.
Motorcycles, is that one?
Motorcycles, engineering, motoring, aviation, comedy, politics, mathematics. And
already you can start to see why it would draw
exactly. I mean,
generalizations on that, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a stereotype, but, you know, if someone said to you, come on, like, if I'll give you £100 if you can correctly guess the sex of this person from this list of interests, you'd probably think it was worth a punt to say male. So it's an understandable mistake. But it did make me think, okay, so this is somewhat overstated. The magic of it is overstated. But there was another thing. I mean, it's partly just me going, I'm a pretty normal 21st century English person. That I spend far too much time on social media and on my devices, and I'm very susceptible to going back to them as a default activity. So I'm pretty typical in that way. But when I started to do the research, there was one thing that really made me think, okay, I think we have this the wrong way around. And it was some marketing people had done some psychology experiments, effectively. They got people into a lab and done sneaky things to them, and they showed them adverts. And they said to them, okay, we're going to show you adverts, and for Group A, we're going to show you random adverts, and Group B, we're going to show you adverts based on your age, sex, occupation, that kind of thing. And Group C, we're going to show you adverts behaviorally targeted, so based on the internet browsing you were doing in the previous session. And spoiler alert, they show them all the same adverts, because that's how sneaky psychology researchers are. And the people who thought that they were targeted because of their own browsing behavior liked the advert best. And it was an advert for a refreshingly sophisticated American eatery. It was fictitious, obviously. But they liked it more than the other two groups because they thought that the algorithm had recognized how sophisticated they were from their browsing behavior. And that's when I went, well, there's mind-blowing moments. Like, it's really true. It's like we basically treat the technology as part of our social world now. And so when we feel that it has recognized something in us, we have the same feeling as, I don't know, if you went out to a restaurant and the waiter said, oh, I can tell you're very sophisticated and here's a wine list for sophisticated people, or whatever. Like, if a real human seems to recognize some quality about yourself that you like, and you like that, I mean, I do, I think we all do. But apparently, if the algorithms do it, it still works. And that was where I went, okay, right, so this is why we have this technology that we keep going back to, even though most of us say this is too creepy and I don't like it collecting the data, but we still keep going back because it taps into that desire to be seen in the way we want to be seen.
Do you think a lot of people treat their phones like somebody who is at least paying them attention even if nobody else is?
Yes, I think that's very well put. Yeah. Maybe not even a friend. Maybe a friend of a friend or a cool person down the pub. But yeah, definitely.
And I don't say that mockingly. I say that as somebody who recognizes what you're saying in the book. When you say it's like any other person, it's like a waiter, putting it in that context too, and it's quite apt that we're in a restaurant, as you use that analogy. I mean, one of the first search engines was called Ask Jeeves, right? That's now an extinct search engine, but the whole idea was that there would be this automaton, this all-knowing thing, who would always be mindful of your needs. And I feel that is what this technology has come to represent in our, as we've said, increasingly atomized society.
And we used to say, big data knows you better than you know yourself, which, I mean, it's obviously not true because all it does is gather data on you and infer things about you by comparing you with other people. Hence, me being a 30-year-old man, because most of the previous people with similar data were 30-year-old men, or at least they said they were. So when we used to say, big data knows you better than you know yourself, it's not true, but it does give away what we kind of want from it. It's like we want it to know us better than we know ourselves, at the same time as being creeped out about it.
Yeah. If you were a 30-year-old man, you might very well be on a dating app about now. Dating apps, they are in a sense the perfect prism through which to look at the way that this personalized technology, when used to try to connect to another person, very quickly comes up against the challenge of commitment to an unknown, commitment to the risk of getting to know or even meet somebody who may not reflect you, and the way that firms like Bumble are trying to adapt to this anxiety by finding ever more sophisticated ways of matching people so that there is no such risk ever. For example, I think the CEO of Bumble recently said she would like to develop an AI concierge for the users of Bumble, which could potentially narrow down all possible matches to, say, 3 people in a city, rather than having to go through date after date, swipe after swipe.
Yeah, didn't she also say that you'll have this kind of AI concierge who will then go on virtual dates with other people's AI concierges? So it's like your AI will date their AI.
That's
and maybe
right,
you never
yes.
even meet at all.
So the AI would be talking to each other, the concierges, and then you would meet up after they've discussed and swapped paperwork and hashed out the deal. I don't know, but...
I know. Well, but exactly. I think there's two things there that you've identified. One of them is we feel we're in this world of kind of infinite choice, which is both exhilarating and a bit frightening. So you live in a city and you feel like, oh, there's could be thousands or millions of people in this city that I might want to date. How on earth am I going to choose? And reality is there probably aren't. There's probably, I don't know, maybe dozens. Maybe I'm unusually choosy, but it's like maybe dozens of people that you would actually want to date or start a relationship with.
Have you ever needed to use dating apps? I never got to that.
I tried them a couple of times, and I found that they basically kept trying to introduce me to people I already knew. And in some cases had previously dated. So that was extremely
not
awkward.
particularly useful.
And it's like, well, the point of view is that you're meant to find me new people I wouldn't normally meet, and all you're doing is making my life very awkward now.
Presumably these apps didn't think you were a 30-year-old man. That was a good start, I guess.
No, well, that was a start, but they did actually ask me whether, maybe I should have said I was. That might have very, very much widened my dating pool. So it's this illusion that you have all this choice, and therefore you need some kind of system to help you navigate it, whereas I'm not actually convinced that there is a massively bigger pool, and or even if it's helpful to think about human beings in that way, because if you are constantly thinking there are 1,000 possible matches for me in this city, then you're constantly going to be metaphorically looking over the shoulder of the person you're actually with, wondering if there's someone better out there. So it just becomes a ranking exercise. So you become your own algorithm. But the other thing is exactly as you say, it's to take away the risk. So the actual terrifying risk of walking up to someone in a bar and trying to open a conversation with them, and the danger of being rejected face to face, is mediated by technology. I mean, quite what you're meant to do at the point where you have met them and you've had a couple of dates and then you decide you don't want to see them again. I don't know, maybe there's an app for that. Dumpo-mat. I don't know. I mean,
Dumpo-mat, I love that.
But it's like, how can you possibly have a relationship without an element of risk? Like any relationship with any degree of intimacy at all necessarily involves risk, because you put your emotions in danger and the other person's emotions in danger. So you can't avoid that unless you really seriously want to have a life without risk, in which case I can tell you're never going to have an intimate relationship and you're going to lose out. But I do think that is one of the bad things about technology, is that it offers us lots of ways to communicate and connect with each other that minimize that risk. So, if you're exchanging text messages with somebody, and I did read this Pew survey that was even before the pandemic. They asked American teenagers, how do you prefer to communicate with your friends? And exchanging text messages actually came slightly above meeting in person, which I was initially horrified by. And then I remembered being a teenager and went, yeah, I can't blame them though, because the absolute terror of making a social faux pas when you're a teenager. If you think, but instead of talking face to face, we could exchange text messages and then I get a few seconds to think about how to reply and they can't see my face, it does start to look appealing. But again, that is how teenagers learn about how to interact as humans, is by making those terrible faux pas and the endless agony of having said the wrong thing.
A big theme of this book is freedom and agency, isn't it? And I just wonder what you think about the propensity for people to choose to relinquish freedom, because that's a lot of what technology, as you've just alluded to, has done for us over the last decade or more, hasn't it? It's given us the choice to say, do you know what, I don't think I want to be entirely responsible for this, or I don't want to have the risk on my shoulders and have to reflect on the choices I made. I'd rather take a safe path that will feel rational, that I can justify because it's what I know others would do with the same device in their hand. What do you think about this? The choice to be less free, and is it freedom if we choose that? I suppose it is, isn't it?
Is it freedom to choose to be less free? Well, that's a great philosophical question. I mean, one thing that I kind of started to think about in the course of writing it was the difference between the idea of choice and the idea of freedom. That what we do have now, far more than any of our ancestors had, is choice. So we have obviously consumer choice, but also choice about how to live. I mean, like, I use the example of me compared to my grandparents, for example, who had very little choice about where to live or what to do, what job to have. My mother's parents left the country a total of once in their life. I've travelled to nearly all the continents. You know, I've moved around, I've studied different things. So in that kind of sense of the choice of how to live, you know, it's like you can now have the kind of relationship you want, certainly in, again, Western democracies. You can have children, not have children, have them when you want, far more than any time in history. So in that sense, we do have choice, and that is a kind of freedom. But then there's another way in which choice is very limited kind of freedom. If you think of choosing things from a menu, or choosing options on a dating site, yes, okay, so you're choosing and you can choose whether to choose, but you have been given a set of options in advance. And that does have a sense of safety associated with it, because you think, well, you know, somebody or some algorithm has approved these options, so, you know, they're not completely random, they must be okay in some way. Whereas the freedom, the kind of radical freedom that perhaps the existentialists talk about, or I talk quite a lot about the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who had an idea of freedom that it's the important freedom is to initiate something new that's never happened before in the world, and set it in motion and hope that you can bring others to it to make it a reality. But once you've set it in motion, you really have quite limited control over how it's going to turn out, or whether other people will in fact join you in it. And if they do, well, of course, you know, they have their own ideas, and they're all human beings, so they're by nature unpredictable. So you're then faced with having responsibility for something you've set in motion without being able to control how it turns out. And that is quite a frightening thing. And in a world where you kind of have the option to not do that, I can see why it's appealing to go, well, you know, I don't really want the responsibility of starting something new and it all going wrong, or people turning on me for it, or something like that. Maybe I will go for the pre-approved choices, and that is a kind of freedom that's enough for me. Yeah,
in the school of life, where we're confronted by many essays that are far more scary, and then multiple choice exams, which I seem to remember were much more comfortable experiences. At the very worst, you could guess, but in guessing, you know that
at least one of the four answers is going to be right.
That's right, yeah.
Whereas, the free-form essays of life, you don't even know whether that's a question, let alone whether you've got the right answer.
That's it.
All you can do is think and write and hope that you can find some other thinkers. And I'm now running out of road with this analogy, but I think that's a very good comparison. It's the tyranny of the blank page, isn't it? There are some tasks in life that confront us with an absolute blank slate, and what are you going to do? And we seem to be increasingly saying, well, actually, I only really want to tackle those questions where, as you say, there's a menu of choice. Well, just thinking, I mean, the writing analogy is useful, I think, because one of the things I've learned as a writer, writing various things over the years, is that it's much, and I'm certainly not the first person to say this, but writing is rewriting, and it's much better to write a terrible first draft and then rewrite it than to stare at a blank page hoping for perfection. And in fact, I used to do screenwriting, and we had a wonderful script editor who said we should expect a minimum of 10 drafts, which is very freeing, because then you think, okay, so it doesn't matter really if the first 8 are rubbish, because you've got 9 and 10 to make it right. And in a way, I think that's a good analogy for life, that it's better to write a terrible first draft and expect to rewrite it and hope that you get a good editor, than to sit waiting until it springs perfectly into your head, because that way you'll never write anything.
But now we're using Grammarly, aren't we? Once again, technology is coming in to save us from the burden of having to write.
We can let ChatGPT write it for us.
Well, exactly. There you go. You take it one step further. You're an author, journalist. You also describe yourself sometimes as a lapsed comedian. So I'm sure you've seen Jerry Seinfeld's recent address at, I can't remember which American university, but in that he said the slogan to ChatGPT should be, "You can't do it." He says it's the opposite of Nike. It's this self-defeating idea we have that AI is the answer. The whole point is to enjoy the process. Like you were saying, those 10 drafts as a writer, it's the journey you take to get to the end, not getting to the end at a click of a button. But we seem to be wanting that more and more. And I wonder what psychologically that's really to do with. Why is it that we fear the journey?
I think it's partly that we live in an increasingly risk-averse world. And that, again, I mean, that's kind of a subject too big for this conversation, so I'm going to write another book about it. But,
of your next book.
But to be specific about it, I think that because we're more and more atomized, it is, in a sense, more risky to initiate things, because you don't necessarily have a social web that you're embedded in where you have a sense of how people might respond or whether people will support you. But you also don't necessarily have good and constant feedback where people go, "Oh, that sounds a bit wrong. Have you thought about this?" That you may well throw something out into the world that nobody else has ever set eyes on and find that it lands very badly. So, you know, I do think there are those reasons for it. But it is also, when we're not very far into, if you like, the post-Nietzschean world of, oh, now God is dead, we are the gods and we're responsible for everything, and the existentialists. I mean, you know, Sartre said it was terrifying to think of this freedom. So, you know, I do think we're actually still finding our way around feeling able to take responsibility for ourselves as free human beings. And we don't live in a society that's very conducive to that, because it doesn't really reward risk-taking, and it punishes things that go wrong if you haven't lined your excuses up. And let's face it, the computer said this was a good idea is a very popular and convincing excuse.
As I mentioned earlier in the conversation, this book takes in many potted histories of technological progress. But one in particular that I found really fascinating was the relationship between the invention of the loom, the weaving loom, and, well, the first computing technology based around the punch card, and how that then evolved into IBM. Perhaps we can talk a little bit about that, a little bit of the historical elements of the book.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we tend to think about data today in a very abstract way, as like mythical ones and zeros that exist on some ethereal plane. But of course, when people first started to try and process information, it was very physical. So there was a system called a jacquard loom, which was literally cards with holes punched in, used so that weavers, relatively unskilled weavers, could mass produce patterned cloth. And it worked by basically where there was a hole in the card, a thread could go through the card into the woven pattern. And where there was no hole, it couldn't go through. So this was a binary. It was like hole, no hole. Then, like, fast forward slightly, maybe 100 years or so, to late 19th century America, where they're taking a census, and the population's growing so fast that they're basically, people by hand are transcribing written census reports into tabulated reports which combine all the aggregated numbers.
Thank you very much.
So choosing off a menu is very,
yes,
it's very on message,
very
isn't
apt.
it?
Yeah, the menu's just arrived here.
So Herman Hollerith, who'd been an employee of the American census, entered a competition to process the information, because they just realised that at this rate, it would take them longer to process the information than the gap between censuses. So they'd be always behind. They'd be doing like the next census before they'd done the one before. And he combined the idea of these punch cards with the library card system, which, fun fact, had been invented during the French Revolution, when the revolutionaries nationalized libraries, and came up with this way where you could turn each census entry into a card with holes punched in, and then you could feed that into a machine which he invented, which put a metal pin through the hole in the card into a little cup of mercury to complete an electrical circuit, and then that would turn a dial to add up the totals of whatever, women of a certain age or, people who with a certain occupation. And so that was how, and he then set up his own company to do this and got lots of international contracts. And then it later merged with other companies and became International Business Machines and then IBM. And of course, then they started using magnetic tape and then digital records. So they don't use punch cards anymore. But up until the 1960s, punch cards were still the default way of recording and storing and processing data. So it was still done physically. It was binary, but it was physical.
And the thing that struck me when I was reading about this was, of course, when the internet first came into the home in the late 90s, early 2000s, I remember those early web pages loading very, very slowly with a kind of a loom-like thread from left to right on the screen as everything slowly loaded. And I don't know whether that really has anything to do visually with the connection between the way that a loom slowly weaves.
Where the shuttle would go to and fro and lay the pattern down. Well, it does in effect, because it's binary but in rows. And so you go along one row, and I mean, obviously, on a computer screen it will be in colour. So you've got 3 colours, but it's still basically, it's on or off, and you go along the row doing on or off, and then you go back along the next row.
Amazing. So, just digitally weaving the picture in front of you. Incredible.
It's very poetic. Okay, I'm going to make a choice from the menus. I must admit, for all my talk about freedom and choice, my main concern with ordering food is to avoid food envy and to... And in one sense, the fewer choices I have, the better, as long as it's things I like. So I won't be having the beetroot falafel because I don't like beetroot. But apart from that, one of my fantasies is that in another life, if I'd been terribly clever, I would by now be an Oxford or Cambridge Don and would just be able to go down to dinner and have somebody feed me without any decisions at all.
Well, you're giving us in real time the thought process behind all our technology here. So long as it's everything you like, no food poisoning involved, thank you very much.
Well, this sounds a bit risky, the steak shin and bishop's finger pie, but of course it's actually bishop's finger ale pie. It's not the actual finger of an actual bishop. I might go for that, yeah. Steak shin and bishop's finger ale pie and mash. Excellent.
Now, we're recording this, of course, in August, and it's terribly muggy, is the term we like to use in the UK. It's very humid, and for that reason alone, much as I love the idea of a pie, it just feels too wintry, too hot. I might therefore go for the roast ham and eggs. And anything to drink?
Oh, heavens, yes, to drink. I'll have a glass of the Montepulciano d'Abruzzo, please. But maybe the question in this case is, if the algorithm was ordering for us, what would it order?
I think I could trust an algorithm knowing what my phone, I guess, knows most about me to order for me. I think that's the sort of thing I could trust it with.
I think if an algorithm did that to me, it would order me steak and chips, because that's often my default order, especially in a new place. Most places, if they serve steak and chips, they don't mess it up too much, and also it's an interesting kind of benchmark then. But then I would be happy with that.
Except when you decide, I'm going on a diet or I've got to change my, the algorithm will just go by what you last ordered, wouldn't it?
Yes, it will, yeah. Also, you might miss out on something interesting, because I have another thing I try and do, which is to try new things. Although then maybe the algorithm would be that smart, it would say, okay, if there's a new thing on the menu you haven't tried before, we'll order you that.
The thing is, I think as you get a bit older and your tastes and your habits and your proclivities become a bit more embedded, you can quite happily outsource a lot of decisions to technology. But interestingly, where technology adoption is so prevalent among the young, who are trying to experiment and work out who they are, it surprises me that not more of them are rejecting technology that presupposes who they are. Does that surprise you too?
Yeah, because you're right. That's the time when you should be experimenting and making mistakes and trying things out.
And you don't want to be understood or known or,
you want to be
down,
new and surprising and trying things. But at the same time, I think this is the thing that increases with every successive generation, it's the insecurity about who you are. And so maybe there is some appetite for developing a persona that is easy to pin down and that is relatively predictable, so that you then know who you are. And not necessarily that you want the algorithm to choose everything for you, but the idea that you settle on who you are. Because, when you think about, if you like, the formal sense of identity, when people say, I have an identity, such and such is part of my identity, and that can be gender identity or sexuality or neurodiversity or cultural things. That there are more and more things that people don't just say, oh well, this is part of who I am. They say this is part of my identity, and then you are saying, here's a label that tells you something that I think is important about me. But once you've applied a label, then that does kind of fix that about you. And one of the things in the book that I felt was really insightful was the philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah talks about Medusa syndrome, where he talks about people who forge a group identity in the course of struggle. And the particular examples he uses are the same-sex attracted people in America who came out, Stonewall, the struggle that followed that for equal rights, and also the Black Power movement in America also. And he describes the process they go through where, they've had a group identity endowed on them by society because society treats them all in the same way and not necessarily a good way. And then they turn that around collectively as a group. They say, no, we're not going to accept this narrative. We're going to forge a new narrative. We're going to reject your old words that you use about us, and we're going to claim our own new names for ourselves, and we're going to make a positive identity as about us defining who we are. But then, Appiah says, the danger is that this identity which you forged in struggle becomes something that imprisons you. So he talks about Medusa syndrome because it's the idea that it turns you to stone. And then you can't change, and you can't grow, and you can't progress, and you can't escape it. And from being something that liberates you, it's something that limits and imprisons you.
Why can't you move on from it once you're liberated?
Because it has become a group identity that's very tightly defined. And he talks about there are battle lines that are drawn and boundaries, and there are ways of being African American or same-sex attracted that are permitted and others that are not permitted. And so you get rules within your identity group, and if you transgress them, I mean, you can certainly, I think you can see this a lot in social movements that people say, oh, well, we thought you were one of us, but you're expressing these attitudes, so you're not really one of us.
Do you mean to say that the struggle for freedom from an oppressor, for want of a better word, on the part of a group, is really the struggle for freedom from each other? The idea that once you are liberated, you have the freedom to disband. And in a sense, become more individualized. Yeah,
it's hard socially and emotionally. And in a sense, you don't need to completely part ways. You have a shared history of struggle for freedom. But you also don't need to have lines that police how you can be part of this group which you no longer need as a bastion against oppression. You can be whatever, same-sex attracted, African American, whatever, in a lot of different ways. You don't necessarily need to only do it in one way. And yet, when it becomes about identity, then there do become these rules about how you can be whatever you are. And that, I think, is what Appiah is saying is, it's an inherent danger. You are bound tightly together by your common experience of oppression and your common experience of struggle. But those bonds should be bonds for the purpose of liberation and not bonds that limit what you can do. Because in a sense, what's the point of freeing yourself from one kind of oppression if then you set your own limits on what you and the others can do?
What do you want people to close this book rethinking about their relationship to technology?
Well, I've tried to be very clear that I'm not telling people to throw their smartphone in the sea and run barefoot into the woods. This is apparently too late for the person I was sailing with the other weekend who did actually throw his smartphone into the sea, although it very much wasn't deliberate. But I did ask him afterwards, I said, have you not read the part of the book where it specifically tells you not to do that? It's not about not using technology. It's about not letting the technology use you. It's about actually thinking, well, what do I want to be doing? What do I want my life to be about? If I was looking back on my life from my deathbed, what kinds of things would I want to be in my obituary? How can I use the technology towards those things? And, it doesn't all have to be, I started a multi-million-pound company or something. It could just be, I raised happy children, or I made an amazing garden, or I wrote a song, or whatever it is. But it's about not getting seduced into limiting yourself to the menu options that the technology offers you, but actually deciding where you want to be going and what you want to be doing, and think, how can I use the technology to get me towards this?
Do you think people aren't asking those questions?
It's very easy to start asking those questions and then find them really hard and intimidating and scary, and instead reach in your pocket for your phone. And I say that as someone who does that all the time. And all those things, they do demand courage. And I think, unfortunately, we're not in an age that rewards courage. So that makes it, even more of a courageous act to be courageous. Because if you are courageous and you put yourself out there and you take a risk and things don't work, people are quite quick to say, oh, well, they should never have tried that. And much slower to say, well, it's good that they tried it, even though it didn't work out, because now we all have a better idea of maybe what would work, and maybe they've learned something, and it was better to try than not to try.
Do you have good examples that come to mind of the reluctance to reward courage?
Well, one example which I found quite disheartening was, there was an example a couple of years ago where a young man jumped off a bridge in London to try and save somebody in the river, and failed and drowned. And I have to say, I really don't advise anyone to jump into the Thames to save somebody else, because it's a very treacherous river. This was at night. The tides run very, very strong. At the same time, I admired the altruistic courage of the young man for doing it. I thought it was a heroic thing to do, precisely because it was extremely risky for him to save a stranger, or rather to attempt to save a stranger, without knowing whether he would succeed. And in fact, he didn't, and he lost his life in the process. So you could say that it was unwise of him to do it. But I still think it was admirable. But I was rather disheartened by when I posted on social media saying how heroic he was and how his parents should be proud of him. And a number of people came back and went, no, he was an idiot and he should never have done it. It was a stupid thing to do. And I felt, well, is there no room in life for people for acts of unwise heroism? So that was one example.
It does say a lot about us, I think, that could be the overwhelming reaction. And it makes you wonder why. What motivates us to point to the risk, the foolishness, the outcome of any particular decision, as opposed to the intention going in? Because had that man survived, you would have had a lot of people praising him on the basis not that he was brave, but that he was brave and survived. Bravery is bravery, and we should recognize and reward bravery in and of itself.
I now fear that actually some people would have still said, well, it's good that he saved him, but it was a stupid thing to have done. But you're right, I think, exactly. It was like, because you cannot know how things will turn out, all you can do is make your best decision at the time. Your motivations and willingness to take risks for other people are the things that we should be judged on, I think. Because if nobody ever took a risk or tried anything new, we wouldn't be living in the world we're living in. We wouldn't have modern technology. We would never have been to the moon. We wouldn't have explored inaccessible parts of the world. We wouldn't have science. There's most of the things that we have today, we have because somebody took a risk. I mean, most of us wouldn't even exist because our parents would have been too shy to talk to each other, and so they would never have got together and produced us.
Yeah, we have a choice, don't we? We have a choice either to stand out and act without full knowledge of what we're getting into, without the full calculation and risk assessment there in front of us, or we default to the safetyism of each choosing pretty much the same of a very limited number of menu options in life. And then unfortunately, we don't reward that either. And instead, there's this sullen, quietly self-loathing recognition that none of us are really doing anything original. But it's a way of keeping each other in check, it seems, if the world that you're describing with the story of that young man is really the world that we're entering more and more.
And I think that is very much the way we're going. I do look at the state of the world and think, this is a world in which most of the people running things have not taken responsibility for keeping them running for the last few decades. And the result is that things are gradually falling apart, and people are like, oh no, this is falling apart. How did that happen? It's like, well, it happened because nobody took responsibility for even keeping it running, let alone for improving it. I mean, Victorians had many, many faults. They were really into eugenics, and they'd certainly had very terrible attitudes to the people living around the empires that they'd conquered and so forth. But they did at least have a sense of progress. They did at least have a sense that things could only get better, that things ought to get better, and that it was somebody's job to make them better. And even if we didn't always like their ideas of what better would consist of, like, for example, eugenics, in some respects, things like sewers and fresh water and railways and things like that, they really built the world that we live in now, and we're letting it fall apart.
Well, fast forwarding on from the Industrial Revolution to, you could say, the new and still reigning just about economic empire that is America. When we talked earlier about individualism in the West, and we talked about the technology that has enhanced our individualism, you mentioned that a lot of this technology is actually built on an understanding of a certain type of person, of which there are relatively very few worldwide. That is to say, they are in a minority, and they belong to what you call weird cultures. Weird standing for, this is W-E-I-R-D, Western, educated, industrialized. Rich, that's the one I was about to say.
Democratic.
Republican. No, rich and democratic. And you write, and I'm quoting the book here, the most individualistic group of people ever studied are American college students. And there is evidence that their trends towards individualism are getting stronger with every succeeding generation. And then it goes on to say, psychology experiments published in peer-reviewed scientific journals are very likely to show what happens when you get a small group of the most individualistic population in the world into a laboratory and study their behavior under entirely artificial conditions. There are assumptions that underlie the technology, largely designed by college-educated Americans, that permeates our lives. That's why we're wrong to think of the technology as targeting universal human needs and desires. It was designed to target needs and desires that are specific to here, to now, to us. You quote Christopher Lasch. His book, The Culture of Narcissism, a book I've quoted many times, deals particularly with the therapeutic culture that has emerged in America since the 1960s, and which I feel, and we've alluded to, birthed this technological age of personalization and self-reflection.
I was so struck. I mean, I've read his book before, and when I was rereading it on my way to the museum in Amsterdam, it was so relevant to today's world of social media and so on, that I actually found myself looking back to see when it was published, because it could have been describing now. And he says, and he's very clear about, a narcissist isn't a super strong, independent individual. A narcissist is someone who depends on the esteem of others. To the narcissist, the world is a mirror. This is a direct quote from him. And it's so well summed up, the world of us all checking social media to see how people are responding to us, that I had to kind of double check that he wrote it in 1979 because it was so prescient. But I think obviously what's happened is he was describing an emerging trend in the 1970s in America, but that really has now permeated all Western democracies. And that sense that you don't feel confident in who you are unless you are reflected back to yourself, I think is very strong. I mean, I'm always reluctant to say it's universal because it affects individuals in different ways, different generations, different countries and so on. But it is very strongly connected, I think, to Western societies. And so the technology that also permeates these societies has evolved to service that particular psychological need.
Well, if we just look at the way that it has affected the United States of America, since Lash was writing mainly about the United States of America, and because America is months away from its next election, you've spoken to a former guest on this series, Chris Bale, author of Breaking the Social Media Prism.
Oh, yes.
Who writes very well about the way in which social media kind of gives the illusion of deep polarization, but also the fact that America very much is polarized by zip code. When you look at the number of Americans voting Republican versus Democrat who barely cross paths with one another, how whole states and whole neighborhoods can be carved out of political inclination, and people find themselves living more and more with those who will vote a similar way to them. How, in a sense, whole swathes of America are becoming like a mirror to those who live in them.
Yeah, I mean, I think Chris Bale's his work is great, actually. And I love the way that he started out thinking the problem was echo chambers and then did some experiments and came away going, oh, actually, no, that's not the problem. The problem is that social media is a machine for building our identities. And so whenever someone disagrees with you, you feel they're attacking your identity. But, I mean, one thing that he notes, and other people have also noted, is that we may not actually be that polarized in terms of what we think about policy questions, but we are emotionally polarized in the way that we see people who disagree with us as being very distant from us and very hostile to us. And there's been research in the UK as well showing that people are more and more hostile to the idea that, for example, their child would marry someone of a different political persuasion. Or even that they would be friends with someone of a different political persuasion, which is kind of horrifying, really, because that really does suggest that it's not even just echo chambers, it's silos of opinion and not being able to exchange ideas or to change your own views. Because if you become that attached to the social and emotional value of belonging to a tribe politically, it's very, very hard to say, oh, actually, maybe on this issue, the other side have a point. In America, it is very polarized between Republicans and Democrats, obviously, and that tribal nature, the identity-driven politics, is a very strong driver of their elections there. I think much more than policy, because actually, if you interview Americans, they have quite a lot of common ground on policy, but they don't realize it because they think the other side is further away. So, I mean, I think you can see that Trump has really keyed into that because he has keyed into the sense that a lot of people felt they were not seen or recognized or listened to by either of the mainstream parties. And it's quite interesting that he's now picked his running mate, J.D. Vance, who wrote Hillbilly Elegy, which was all about how Rust Belt America felt completely ignored and devalued. And if you look at the recent UK election, the two main parties got the lowest share of the vote between them since universal adult suffrage. So since all of us adults in Britain got the vote, the two main parties have never had such a low share of the vote. Between them, they got 57%. And a number of the smaller parties now have significant numbers of MPs. And a lot of that is driven by, I think, the same perception that the mainstream parties are not listening to us. They don't care about us. They don't care what we think. We're going to vote for somebody else.
It might seem like a strange way to wrap this up, but I'm going to try to connect what we were talking about earlier about the loom and data computing technology with respect to fashion. Let's take threads and let's take technology and let's smash them together in this summary, because you've always struck me as somebody who has a very distinct fashion sense. I hope that didn't come across as anything other than complimentary.
No, I tell you that's a compliment, because I think of myself as somebody with no fashion sense at all.
But this is why I bring it up, and the reason why is because Gen Z have become known as a generation that really rejects all identity-constraining definitions and tribal allegiances when it comes to fashion. They tend to wear anything they want without context. It's all devoid of any particular movement, any particular genre, any particular look, any particular era. Anything goes. Do you think that they actually understand and have the measure of technology more than we give them credit for? As a millennial, I might have skepticism and suspicion and worries about technology. You might have yours too, but I wonder whether actually the more embedded technology is in the lives of young people, the less they see it as a problem and the more they've learned to adapt to it in ways that perhaps you or I don't really understand. What do you think?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think they deal with it in a very sophisticated way and use it and understand its changing kind of facilities and codes. Much more freely than you or I would. Definitely. And so there's the awareness of how we relate to algorithms and how they are part of our social fabric. I think is very much about them having grown up with this, and it is as much a part of their social circle as, for example, for our generation, what music you listen to and what you wear is part of your social interactions. So I do think in that sense it is just I think I'd say at some point digital profiling is just an extension of fashion by other means, because it's still a way of expressing who you are in the social setting. It's just that maybe you are doing it more through a digital persona and less through going to your local bar or whatever dressed in your latest fashionable outfit. And I do think fears about young people and technology are often overblown. They often very much focus on the negative sides and slightly perhaps forget that for young people, social life has always been in some ways tricky, because you're learning to be an independent person in the world, and it is a bit of a social minefield. So I don't worry in that sense, and I do think they probably do use it in a much more self-aware, sophisticated way probably than we do. But I think the worry is that in as much as it reflects back that identity-driven sense of yourself in the world, that is already stronger as we go down the generations, because the social ties are getting weaker. So I worry much more about that side than about the technology. I think the technology, they're fine. They know more about it than we ever will.
Well, I hope this conversation has given listeners some idea as to why technology is not the problem, but to find out the full history of said technology down the ages and what we're to do with all that technology can do for us and perhaps against us. Read the book. It's a fantastic book and I recommend it very highly. Timandra Harkness, thank you very much for joining me on the Booking Club, and now we get to enjoy what we've ordered. What do we have here, Timandra? You've ordered the...
That's the steak, shin and bishop's finger ale pie with mash, and the gravy's just arrived. And what did you go for in the end?
And I went for the ham and eggs, a pretty staunch, well, both of them very classic dishes for a pub. It looks fantastic, and we've waited long enough, so let's get stuck in. Thank you very much, Timandra.
Thank you.